a nearly $20 million budget shortfall and a potential state takeover, the Austin Independent School District proposed a plan to close 13 schools and redraw boundaries, impacting almost every school in the district. This week on Inside the Investigation, our team discusses the rising anger among parents and staff over the plan and how it could reshape the region. Thanks for joining us. You're listening and watching Inside the Investigation. I'm Kelly Wiley, and with me in the studio this week is digital data reporter Christopher Adams. Christopher, good to see you in the studio again.
Good to see you, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
All right, so last week, Austin ISD unveiled this long-awaited plan for closing schools. And we've known for a long time that this was coming. For months, district leaders were hinting at consolidation, really in order to tackle this deficit that they have, this shortfall. But 2 months ago, the district said they were for sure going to close schools, and they gave a clue as to how they were going to decide which ones to close.
Right, so the district unveiled a score system, essentially, for every campus. This was back in August, where they graded each school, but not by academic standards. Instead, they were looking at things like capacity, how over-enrolled or under-enrolled was a specific campus. They looked at the condition of the building. They looked at the costs to keep that school open, both educational costs and also facility maintenance costs as well. So there were 5 of these categories overall. Each score was graded in each of those categories from 1 to 5, 1 being the best score, 5 being the worst score. And the district then gave each school an overall score based on those 5 categories.
And the district made a point in their meetings with us to say these scores, this wasn't a closure list. And they did this because, as you can imagine, anytime you see a grade applied to the school where your children attend, parents are not really, they're freaking out over what that might mean.
Right.
But they were essentially saying the lowest scoring school is not necessarily the school that's going to be closing. And there's important context because these were not the only scores that were top of mind for district leaders or for parents at the time. In the background of this conversation was this looming threat of a state takeover.
Yeah, exactly. So when these campus scores that the district put out, they were also dealing with a slew of unacceptable accountability ratings from the state. So every year, the Texas Education Agency, which is essentially the state's education department, they rate every school campus and school district in the state. And this is primarily based on student outcomes, things like performance in the STAR test. So this is important context here because in AISD, there are 3 schools, Burnett, Dobie, and Webb middle schools, who have now received 4 F ratings in a row. And that's important because if any one school receives 5 in a row, that opens the district up for state takeover. And what we mean by that is essentially the state can come in and replace the elected board of trustees with a state-appointed board of managers, similar to what we had happen in Houston ISD, if you remember that. So these 3 AISD schools are in this very precarious predicament right now. If they receive another F rating next year, that opens the district up to state takeover. And to complicate things even further for the district, there are even more schools just behind those. There are 12 more schools in a similar situation who at this point have received 3 F ratings in a row.
So let's level set. The situation we have, there are some parents that fear their school might close based on being the lowest academically performing. And then we have others that fear their school may close because they have this lowest facility score based on capacity and the condition of the building. But the reality of the draft plan that the district released, I think, threw a lot of people off guard. Let's talk about why.
Yeah, so the draft plan includes the closure of 13 schools, and we have a map that we can show you here of those 13 schools that are slated for closure, or if you're listening to us on the podcast, you can find this interactive map over at KXAN.com. 2 of the schools are middle schools, 11 are elementary schools, including one that is a Montessori school. Now, in the state's accountability ratings, so these are those A through F ratings that the TEA, the Texas Education Agency, gives out, 7 of the 13 schools that are currently set for closure have received an F rating. 4, though, have received a B rating, and there's one green dot on that map, Maplewood Elementary School, that actually is an A-rated school currently. So it's not the case that the district is just closing the lowest performing schools. Now, when we talk about those capacity and condition school scores, it's also not the case that they are just closing the lowest performing schools there. Let's take Barrington Elementary, for example. That one has a score of 1.79 out of 5. Again, remember, 1 is the best score that a district could have, 5 is the lowest, so 1.79 is not a particularly bad score. Still, though, some people might be thinking, why not just close those lowest performing schools? Wouldn't that just be the easy option and make this problem go away, Kelly?
And really, it's so much more complicated than that. Our team has been realizing as we've been reporting on this. It's just not as simple as close an F-rated campus and the district no longer has to do anything to improve student outcomes. When a school gets 3 Fs, and we've talked about this before, they have to develop what's called a turnaround plan, and that's a state requirement. And they can be quite disruptive. We've seen that with Dobie, Webb, and Burnett, where they had a lot of staff take turnover because as a part of the turnaround plan, the districts have to establish new requirements for what it means to be a highly effective teacher. And then they have to run that plan by the state and get approval. And we saw when they set that for Dobie, Burnett, and Webb, that meant that a large part of their core teaching staff could no longer stay at that school and either had to find new placements within the district or resign and find a new job outside of the districts. It can also mean more resources for the school. In fact, in these cases, it's definitely going to mean more resources for the school. That's also a part of the turnaround plan. So according to AISD, the current turnaround plans at the 7 F-rated schools that are set to close, whatever turnaround plan is developed for those schools will follow the students to their new campus. So for example, Martin Middle School, they're on their 3rd F. They're going to need a turnaround plan, and it's now set to close. So according to the plan, students currently at Martin will go to Keeling, Lively, and Marshall Middle School. They'll go to one of the 3. Those will be their new zone schools. Superintendent Matias Segura told me in an interview this week that whichever campus gets the majority of the students from the closed campus will then have to take the turnaround plan. And the district gives a very detailed look at what this would mean for Martin in particular. In this case, the school that's getting the majority is Keeling Middle School. What's very interesting is Keeling is an A-rated campus. So imagine this plan gets approved as is, which they've said many times is they're open to tweaks. If this plan happens as is, you're going to have an A-rated top performing school in the district that's going to get a turnaround plan as though they've had 3 consecutive Fs. And I think that's what's kind of not sitting well with families.
Right, a red flag, especially for those families at Keeling, which is A-rated. You mentioned these turnaround plans can be very disruptive for these schools. You did speak to Superintendent Segura about this and specifically about the Marshall and Keeling middle school situation. What did he have to say about that?
He told me in this case, they are likely to develop a turnaround plan that accounts for the fact that the school may already be high performing because it's A-rated. When we think about Keeling, for example, Dobie, Burnett, and Webb, that wasn't the case. 4 consecutive Fs, and they really needed to improve, and they had this state required plan. So unlike Dobie, where they lost 84% of their core teaching staff, had to appoint a new principal, the change at Keeling, according to what the superintendent says, under this plan probably would not be as significant, but we really won't know until the turnaround plan is drafted and accepted by the state. And we should also point out that there are other examples where if these schools close, students will go from an F-rated campus to a B campus. So maybe not an A, but a B is certainly not underperforming. We've also seen questions about what happens to the bond money allocated to these schools. I can't tell you how many times we've had parents reach out about this because bond was a hot topic at one point. Voters approved a $2.4 billion bond in 2022 to repair, modernize, and rebuild aging schools across the district. Of that, almost $190 million was slated to go to the 13 schools that are under this plan expected to close. Christopher, break down what's going to happen to that money and what the district is telling us about that.
Yeah, well, KXAN's education reporter Nabil Ramadhan looked into this on Thursday evening. It's a complicated issue because that almost 190 million slated to go to these 13 schools, some of that money has already been spent. A lot of it, though, it has still not been spent. So what happens to that money? Well, Superintendent Segura did touch on this briefly last week. He said his initial thought and his initial recommendation here was that the money should move with the students to whatever new campus they go to. Now, it's unclear how the district would approach this because in some cases, students will be split up across multiple campuses. So will the money be split as well, or would it simply follow where the majority of the students go? So that still remains to be seen. But the superintendent did also say there are some instances where students may move to schools that don't necessarily need those additional funds, potentially Keeling, for example, which is an A-rated school, because they are already in good shape facility-wise, the maintenance of that new building. Now, in that case, he said the district would find alternative solutions, alternative uses for that money, and ultimately it is up to the board to decide what to do if there is any surplus money left over here. Now, I think it's also important to mention here, Kelly, we're talking about these 13 schools that are closing, but there are significant and far-reaching impacts beyond those 13 schools, because also in this plan, there are big changes to school zones and feeder patterns from elementary to middle to high, and those changes are going to affect 98% of schools in the district. So even if your child is at one of these schools that isn't closing, chances are there's still going to be some pretty big impacts for you. A lot of parents are now realizing, for example, Kelly, that they go to a school currently, but they are zoned for a completely different school for the next school year. That is raising a lot of questions. I know you've spoken to some parents who are concerned about what happens with siblings. If I have a child in one school, will their younger sibling be able to get into that school, even if they're no longer zoned for that school? What has the superintendent said about those sorts of situations, Kelly?
Well, you know, it's a big question when we're not just getting that question from parents that we meet out on these stories, but parents in our own newsroom were coming up to me asking me that question. The good news is, for a lot of families, despite their school zone changing under this draft plan, so still has to be approved, we should say that, if they have a child currently enrolled at the school, the district has said that they'll have the option during the enrollment process next year to remain at that school that they currently go to, or they can choose to go to their newly zoned school. And I asked specifically, what will parents need to do? Is this something, how will this come up? Where do they need to actually do this? And he was saying this will be online. It'll be a drop-down menu where you'll get to select the school where your student currently attends, or this newly zoned school. So look out for that if this plan passes. But for siblings, it's a slightly different story. AISD has always allowed parents to request their child be able to transfer to a campus that maybe their older sibling attends. The transfer request is prioritized, but it's not guaranteed in this case. And the policy really is the same, even if the draft plan is adopted. You'd be able to ask for that priority school assignment if you had a sibling currently under the current structure and policies, and under the new, if this draft plan passes, you'll still have that ability.
Now, you mentioned this as a draft plan. We want to emphasize that this is not set in stone yet. The board still has to make a final decision on this. We know that the district will be hosting several open meetings for parents and community members, teachers, to give their feedback on this plan. How receptive do you think the district is going to be with this feedback? Could they make tweaks to this plan based on the kind of feedback that they're getting from the community?
It's hard to tell. You know, this isn't a loose plan. It's very specific. Yeah. And the district, in their own words, they've said they put a lot of thought into it, and this is their most thoughtful plan for how to move forward with consolidation. But they're going to have a lot of criticism to contend with. Already, we've seen parents and students protesting this. Just yesterday, they were protesting at AISD headquarters. Becker Elementary is one example. They're a wall-to-wall dual language program in AISD. The district is proposing to close the school and move the dual language program 3 miles away from South Austin to Sanchez Elementary in East Austin. The district says, from their perspective, this will give more students across the district access to these essential programs. But, this is also going to have a domino effect, likely, right? Because students at Sanchez who are not in the dual language program will be reassigned to 3 other schools based on their address. We've heard Becker parents and others say, if this happens and the plan is approved, they will take their kids out of the district entirely, because one extra layer of context, as if we need one more thing to complicate the situation, is, we've got this program coming up where the state has approved taxpayer dollars to go to some families to, go to private schools, to homeschool. There'll be more choice injected into the situation as they are implementing this controversial plan.
Yeah, so that's the so-called education savings accounts that we know lawmakers passed earlier this year. Takes effect next school year, which is the same time that any changes to AISD schools and boundaries will take effect as well. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about principals and teachers at these 13 schools that are currently set to close. Do we know what will happen to them? Will there be any layoffs here?
Right, that's the other fear there, the teachers knowing what turnaround plans look like at other campuses, but then also consolidation in general. The idea is there would be less campuses. So the superintendent told me he can't guarantee that there won't be any job loss as a result of this plan if approved, but he says it's their intention to find a new place for every staffer that is displaced. He said they're freezing hiring at the district office to create more landing spots for teachers who might lose their position. And they're not going to look at external hires until April to give staff more time to interview with other campuses and kind of find their spot. So he was really adamant in our conversation that he thinks that there can be a place for everyone, but he's also factoring in natural attrition, people that retire, people who might just resign.
Yeah. What about the buildings themselves? We know the major reason behind this push to consolidate is the budget deficit, the $20 million budget deficit. If a campus closes, can the district just sell off those buildings and help with those budget issues?
Well, the plan says that for each campus, district staff will make a recommendation to the board by the end of this school year about whether to reuse it or to lease the building or sell it. A couple examples: Peace Elementary closed 5 years ago. The district still owns that building, but they do lease it to the United Way for Greater Austin to operate an early childhood education center. And AISD is in the process also of selling the former Rosedale School campus to a local developer and builder of multifamily residential housing. So it's an example of what the district selling off these properties could look like, but some of the schools will be reimagined. So think about Bedichek and Martin Middle Schools. They are slated for closure. They're one of the 13, but the district kind of paints a different story for what can happen in the coming years. The district says they plan to reopen these campuses. Specifically, AISD is looking at creating K-8 schools instead of standalone middle schools. I was actually talking to a researcher this week out of Arkansas that studied consolidation in their area. And he talked about what some of the issues can be with kids having too many transitions, right? Like they're going from elementary to middle, maybe to junior high in some states, then to high school, and that can be disruptive for the student. It can cause issues for their educational outcomes. And specifically with middle school, when you think about it, you're kind of transitioning 2/3 of the time that you're there. You're transitioning in as a 6th grader and you're transitioning out as an 8th grader. And so the concept of K-8 is to decrease the amount of times that children are seeking or having disruptions in what feels like a constant to them. So it is interesting that for those 2 middle schools in particular, they are reimagining how to make, in the long run, right? Not right now. Right now, we're looking at more transitions, but in the long run, making it a situation where maybe we can get some better educational outcomes just from how we structure out our schools.
And again, we have that interactive map of the 13 schools currently set to close on KXAN.com, but we want to stress once again, this is just a draft plan for now. The board will make its final decision on this plan on November 20th, and any changes would then take effect next school year, so 2026, 2027. That's a year from now almost, but the district says it needs that much time. The vote needs to happen now because it needs plenty of time to prepare. There are a couple things that they need to set up. First of all, the new boundaries, they need to add that to their enrollment system. So when families are applying or going through the enrollment process, they have that already set up on the online portal. They also need time to make sure they have the right teachers and school leaders at each campus. For example, they say principals will be selected in December. And so they want to give them ample time to prepare for the new school year as well. So mark your calendars, November 20th is, when this big vote is going to take place. Kelly, do we have any indication of how the board may vote on this? Is this a done deal?
Hard to tell. I hate to keep giving that response. I mean, we've already heard from board members who say there'll be a no vote. So if the plan stays as is, at least. Trustee Catherine Whitley-Chu said in a statement, she understands the intentions and the pressures that led to this proposal. They paint this picture, one in which we've been talking about at our station and online and on air for a while, that there's the financial they feel financially strapped, these school districts, over state funding. But then also there's so many ancillary things that are going on from the TEA perspective and over these schools where they could lose agency, right? If these schools fail to improve. So she says she understands the intentions and the pressures that have led up to this point, but she said she doesn't think the district should close schools that are in demand and have strong academic results. So it kind of brings us all the way back full circle to the data that they were using for this, right? Maplewood is an A school. That sounds like what she's referencing here. And then we're talking about schools that are in demand. So maybe their enrollment or their capacity at their school is higher. But in my conversation with the superintendent, he kind of brought it up to like a 50,000 foot view of what they're trying to do. And he says he sees this as AISD's bold Band-Aid rip that will put the system in a better position overall. One where they don't have empty buildings, one where they can put more resources into fewer schools, and one where critical programs are more accessible to the region. And he really stressed, speaking about this looming state takeover, he really stressed that right now, they have local control. They can make bold moves where he says he knows how thoughtful that they can be about making those bold moves. And he says his biggest fear is the school district losing local control and losing that agency to make local decisions.
Of course, we will be following this throughout. That big vote is on November 20th, but we know the district, as we mentioned, will be having those several open house meetings where parents and community members can give their feedback on this plan before that vote happens. You can find all of that information, those dates, on KXAN.com, as well as our interactive map showing the 13 schools that are set to close. And you can dig into the data that Kelly and I have been mentioning, those A through F accountability ratings, and also some of those capacity and condition ratings for each school as well. Again, that's all on KXAN.com. I'm Christopher Adams.
And I'm Kelly Wiley. Thanks for joining us this week on Inside the Investigation. We'll see you next time.